The gunshot that killed Margaret Zimmerman's husband echoed through the canyon on a scorching afternoon in July of 1878, and with it, she believed every dream she had ever held dear died too. Margaret stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave in Sierra City, California, her black dress clinging to her thin frame in the oppressive heat. She was 24 years old, and the man being lowered into the ground had been her companion for 6 years. Thomas had been a good man, a gentle farmer who had brought her west with promises of a better life. Now she stood alone, watching the red earth swallow him whole, and felt nothing but a vast emptiness that threatened to consume her entirely. The small gathering of neighbors offered their condolences with awkward pats on her shoulder and murmured words she barely heard. They spoke of God's plan and better days, but Margaret knew the truth. Without Thomas, without the protection of a husband in this unforgiving land, she had nothing. Their small farm on the outskirts of town would likely be seized for debts she could not pay. She had no family back east to return to, no prospects, no future worth imagining. As the last shovel of dirt fell upon the grave, Margaret turned and walked back toward the farm alone, her shoes raising small clouds of dust with each step. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she thought perhaps it would be easier to simply lie down in the middle of the road and let the heat take her too. But she did not lie down. She kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because that was what one did. That was what survival demanded, even when survival felt more like punishment than salvation. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of grief and practical concerns. Margaret discovered that Thomas had left debts she had not known about. The bank held a note on the farm that was due in 3 months, and there was no possible way she could raise the money. She tried to tend the fields herself, but the work was backbreaking, and she was not strong enough to manage alone. The crops withered in the heat, and with them, her last shred of hope. 3 weeks after the funeral, Margaret sat at her kitchen table staring at the notices of debt collection when she heard a knock at her door. She considered not answering, but the knock came again, firm but not demanding. When she opened the door, she found a man standing on her porch, hat in hand. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. His dark hair needed cutting, and several days of stubble shadowed his jaw. He looked to be in his late 20s, and there was something in his bearing that suggested both strength and gentleness. "Mrs. Zimmerman?" he asked, his voice low and respectful. "Yes," Margaret replied, her own voice sounding hollow to her ears. "My name is Isaac Northwood, madam. I worked with your husband on occasion, helped him with some of the heavier farm work when he needed an extra hand." He turned his hat in his hands as he spoke. "I heard about what happened, and I wanted to offer my condolences. Thomas was a good man." "Thank you," Margaret said automatically. She waited for him to state his real business, for surely he had not come all this way merely to offer sympathy. Isaac seemed to sense her skepticism. "I also came to offer my help, if you would accept it. I know the farm needs tending, and I have some time before I need to move my herd north. I could help get the crops in, maybe make some repairs around the place." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. She had learned early in life that men did not offer help without expecting something in return. "I cannot pay you," she said bluntly. "I did not ask for payment," Isaac replied. His gray eyes met hers steadily. "Sometimes folks just need help, and sometimes other folks are in a position to give it. That is all I am offering." Something in his straightforward manner made Margaret want to believe him, but trust was a luxury she could not afford. "Why would you do that?" Isaac was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "When I was 15, my parents died of fever, left me and my sister alone. We would have starved if it were not for neighbors who helped us through that first year, expecting nothing in return. I figure I owe the world a debt for that kindness." Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but found only honest weariness and a genuine desire to help. Still, she hesitated. "Just let me fix your fence line," Isaac said. "I noticed it is down in several places on my way up here. A few hours' work. If you decide you do not want any more help after that, I will tip my hat and be on my way." There was something in his voice, a lack of pressure or expectation, that made Margaret's resistance crumble slightly. "All right," she heard herself say. "The fence." Isaac's face broke into a small smile, and he placed his hat back on his head. "I will start tomorrow morning if that suits you." "Tomorrow is fine," Margaret replied, and watched as he walked back to his horse, mounted with easy grace, and rode away down the dusty road. That night, Margaret lay in her empty bed and wondered if she had made a mistake. She had spent the weeks since Thomas's death avoiding people, avoiding life itself. The thought of having someone around, of making conversation and maintaining appearances, exhausted her. But the fence did need mending, and she supposed there was no harm in letting him do that one task. Isaac arrived the next morning just after dawn, bringing his own tools and wire. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as he worked, moving with efficient purpose along the fence line. He did not approach the house or seek her out, simply did the work he had promised, and then rode away with a polite wave. He returned the next day and repaired the barn door that had been hanging crooked. The day after that, he replaced several broken shingles on the roof. Each day he worked for a few hours, and then departed without asking for anything, without even expecting conversation. Margaret found herself watching him more than she intended. There was something calming about the steady rhythm of his work, the quiet competence with which he approached each task. He did not whistle or sing like some men did while working, but neither did he seem burdened by the labor. He simply did what needed doing with a focused determination that she found oddly comforting. On the fourth day, as the afternoon heat reached its peak, Margaret brought him a cup of water. It seemed cruel to let him work in such heat without offering basic hospitality. Isaac accepted the cup with a grateful nod. "Thank you, madam. That is very kind." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and then Margaret found herself asking, "What happened to your sister?" "You mentioned you had a sister." "Sarah," Isaac said, his face softening. "She married a shopkeeper in Sacramento 5 years ago, has 3 children now. I see her when I can." "That must be nice," Margaret said quietly, "having family." Isaac looked at her with understanding in his eyes. "Thomas mentioned you were alone in the world when you married, that you came west with no kin. My parents died when I was young. I was raised in an orphanage in Boston." Margaret was not sure why she was telling him this. She had not spoken of her past to anyone in years. "Thomas was a clerk in a law office where I worked as a cleaning woman. He asked me to marry him and come west to start fresh. It seemed like a miracle at the time." "He was a fortunate man to have found you," Isaac said simply. The sincerity in his voice brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, uncomfortable with the emotion. "I should let you get back to work." "Mrs. Zimmerman," Isaac said as she turned to go. "I know it probably does not seem like it right now, but things do get easier. Not better, maybe, but easier. The pain becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried back to the house. That night, she allowed herself to cry for the first time since the funeral. She cried for Thomas, for the life they had tried to build, for the loneliness that stretched before her like an endless desert. But when the tears finally stopped, she felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the possibility that hope might someday return. Isaac continued to come each day, and slowly, Margaret began to emerge from her grief-stricken isolation. She started preparing lunch for him, simple meals of bread and cheese and whatever vegetables her struggling garden could provide. They ate together on the porch, speaking little at first, but gradually finding topics of conversation that came more easily. He told her about his work as a cattle rancher, about the herd he was building on land he leased north of town. She told him about the books she loved to read, the few precious volumes Thomas had bought for her over the years. Isaac admitted he had never learned to read well, having left school after his parents died to work, and Margaret offered to help him improve his skills. So began a new routine. Isaac would work on the farm in the mornings. They would share lunch, and then Margaret would spend an hour helping him practice reading from her small collection of books. He was a quick learner, determined and focused, and Margaret found she enjoyed teaching him. It gave her a sense of purpose she had been lacking. "Why did you really come here?" Margaret asked one afternoon as they sat on the porch, a book resting between them. The truth, not the story about repaying kindness. Isaac was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "I saw you at the funeral," he finally said. "I saw the way you stood alone, and I recognized that look. I have worn it myself. I thought maybe you could use someone who understood what it felt like to have everything ripped away." "So you pitied me," Margaret said, hearing the bitterness in her own voice. "No," Isaac said firmly. "Pity is feeling sorry for someone from a distance. This is something different. This is recognizing pain because you have lived it yourself, and knowing that sometimes all a person needs is for someone to show up and stay." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "You have been very kind," she managed to say. "You make it easy," Isaac replied, and there was something in his voice that made Margaret look at him more closely. What she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. It was not pity or even simple compassion. It was something warmer, something that both terrified and intrigued her. As summer deepened into August, the farm began to show signs of recovery under Isaac's care. The crops that had been struggling started to thrive with proper attention. The buildings stood straighter, the fences held firm. Even the animals seemed healthier, as if they sensed the presence of someone who knew how to care for them properly. But it was not just the farm that was reviving. Margaret noticed changes in herself. She slept better at night. She found herself humming sometimes while doing chores. She looked forward to Isaac's arrivals each morning with an anticipation that felt both wonderful and guilt-inducing. How could she feel anything resembling happiness when Thomas had been gone only 2 months? What kind of wife was she to enjoy another man's company so soon after burying her husband Isaac? Must have sensed her internal struggle, because he never pushed for more than she was willing to give. He never stood too close, never let his hands linger when they accidentally touched. He was unfailingly respectful, treating her like something precious and fragile that might shatter if handled roughly. One evening in late August, Margaret was hanging laundry when dark clouds rolled in with unexpected speed. The first drops of rain fell as she rushed to gather the clothes, and then the sky opened up with a fury that sent her running for the house. Isaac had been working in the barn, and he appeared at her door moments after she tumbled inside, both of them drenched and laughing at the suddenness of the storm. "I cannot remember the last time it rained like this," Margaret said, pushing wet hair from her face. The drought had been severe and the rain was desperately needed. "The land needed it," Isaac agreed, removing his hat and shaking water from it. "Your crops will be grateful." They stood in the kitchen, dripping on the floor, and suddenly the laughter faded as they became acutely aware of being alone together in the house. the storm raging outside creating an intimate atmosphere that felt both dangerous and electric. "I should get you a towel," Margaret said, her voice sounding breathless even to her own ears. "Margaret," Isaac said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with being wet. She turned to face him fully. "Yes, I need to tell you something," he said, his gray eyes intense. "These past months coming here, working alongside you, getting to know you, it has been the best time of my life. I know it is too soon. I know you are still grieving, but I cannot keep pretending this is just neighborly kindness anymore." Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you," Isaac said simply. "I am saying that when I think about my future, you are in every vision of it. I am saying that I know it is too soon and you may not ever feel the same way, but I needed you to know the truth." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Margaret felt as if she stood at the edge of a cliff, and one step forward would send her tumbling into the unknown. "I feel it too," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was wrong, but I feel it too." Isaac closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and took her face gently in his hands. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Margaret breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and seeking and full of restrained passion. The kiss was everything and nothing like she had expected. Thomas had been her only experience with romance, and his kisses had been pleasant but perfunctory. This was different. This was fire and lightning and coming alive after being dead. This was choosing to feel again after choosing numbness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I will wait as long as you need," he said. "I am not asking you to rush anything. I just needed you to know how I felt." "I do not want to wait," Margaret said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I have spent too much of my life waiting for permission to want things, to need things. Thomas would not have wanted me to stop living. He was a good man, and good men want the people they love to be happy." "Are you sure?" Isaac asked, searching her face. "I am sure that I am tired of being afraid," Margaret said. "I am sure that you have shown me it is possible to feel joy again. I am sure that I want to see where this leads." Isaac kissed her again, deeper this time, and Margaret let herself sink into it, let herself feel the full force of emotions she had been holding back. The storm raged outside, but inside, she felt safe and warm and wonderfully, terrifyingly alive. They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking about everything and nothing. Isaac told her about his dreams of building a successful ranch, of creating something lasting. Margaret confessed her fear of the debts hanging over the farm, the notices from the bank that kept coming. "How much do you owe?" Isaac asked. Margaret told him the amount, and he was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What if we combined our resources?" he said finally. "What if you sold this land, paid off the debts, and we used what was left to expand my ranch? We could build a life together, a real life." "Isaac, I cannot ask you to do that," Margaret protested. "You are not asking, I am offering." He took her hand in his. "I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards, but sometimes you just know when something is right. I knew the first time I saw you that you were going to change my life. I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You want to marry me, more than anything," Isaac said, "but only if it is what you want to. I will not pressure you. If you need time, I will give you time." Margaret thought about the empty years stretching behind her, the loneliness that had defined so much of her life. Then she thought about the past months, the slow awakening of hope, the gradual return of color to a world that had gone gray. She thought about Isaac's steady presence, his kindness, the way he made her feel seen and valued. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." The joy that lit Isaac's face was like watching the sun rise after a long night. He pulled her into his arms and held her close, and Margaret felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like coming home. They were married in September, a simple ceremony in the small church in Sierra City with Isaac's sister Sarah and her family as witnesses. Margaret wore a dress of pale blue instead of white, and she carried wildflowers Isaac had picked that morning. It was nothing like her first wedding, which had been formal and proper and weighted with nervousness about an uncertain future. This wedding felt like a celebration, like a declaration of life continuing despite hardship. When Isaac slipped the ring on her finger and spoke his vows, Margaret felt tears stream down her face, but they were tears of happiness, not sorrow. The ranch Isaac had been building was modest but well constructed. A sturdy house with 2 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a porch that overlooked rolling hills where cattle grazed. Sarah had helped prepare it for Margaret's arrival, filling it with small touches that made it feel welcoming. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a coming together that felt both natural and miraculous. Isaac was patient and gentle, attuned to Margaret's needs and responses in a way that made her feel cherished. Afterward, lying in his arms, Margaret felt a peace she had never known before. "Are you happy?" Isaac asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "I did not think I could ever feel this way again," Margaret admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought that was it. I thought life had given me my one chance and it was over." "Life is full of second chances," Isaac said. "And third and fourth ones too, if we are willing to take them." "I am so glad you came to my door that day," Margaret whispered. "So am I," Isaac replied, kissing her forehead. "So am I." The first months of their marriage were an adjustment as they learned each other's rhythms and habits. Margaret had never run a ranch before, and there was much to learn about cattle, about managing grazing land, about the business side of ranching. Isaac was patient, teaching her what she needed to know while respecting the skills and knowledge she brought to their partnership. She proved to have a good head for numbers and took over managing the ranch's accounts, finding ways to cut costs and improve efficiency. She also discovered she had a talent for dealing with the merchants and buyers who came to negotiate for cattle. Her quiet strength and sharp mind earned their respect in ways that surprised even her. The sale of her farm had brought enough to pay off Thomas's debts, with a small amount left over. Margaret insisted they use that money to buy additional breeding stock for the ranch. It was an investment in their future, a tangible way of moving forward while honoring what had come before. As autumn painted the hills in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret found herself settling into the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to ride better, accompanying Isaac when he checked on the cattle. She tended a large garden that provided vegetables for their table and extra to sell in town. She made friends with the other ranch wives in the area, women who welcomed her into their circle with warmth and acceptance. Sarah became not just a sister-in-law but a true friend. She visited often with her children, and Margaret delighted in being an aunt to the boisterous youngsters. Sarah's husband, Robert, was a kind man who clearly adored his wife, and watching them together gave Margaret a vision of what long married love could look like. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow and forcing everyone indoors for long stretches. Margaret and Isaac spent the evenings by the fire, reading together and talking about their plans for the spring. It was during one of these quiet nights that Margaret realized she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Isaac, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally shared the news on a cold January evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time, declaring it the best news he had ever received. "I am going to be a father," he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. "You are going to be a wonderful father," Margaret assured him, and she meant it. She had seen the way he was with Sarah's children, patient and playful and genuinely interested in their young lives. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. As Margaret's belly grew, so did Isaac's protectiveness. He tried to take over all her chores, insisting she rest, until she firmly reminded him that she was pregnant, not ill, and perfectly capable of managing her responsibilities. "I just want to take care of you," he said, looking slightly chastened. "You do take care of me," Margaret replied, softening, "but I need to feel useful. I need to know I am contributing to our life together." They found a balance, with Isaac taking on the heavier tasks while Margaret handled what she comfortably could. The ranch was thriving under their joint management, the herd growing, their reputation for quality cattle spreading throughout the region. In June, as summer heat returned to the valley, Margaret went into labor. Sarah came to help, bringing her experience and calm presence. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. There were moments when Margaret thought she could not endure another minute, when the pain seemed beyond bearing. But Isaac never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement and love. His presence gave her strength when her own flagged, reminded her she was not alone in this ordeal. Finally, as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, their son was born. A healthy, strong-lunged baby who announced his arrival with vigorous crying. When Sarah placed him in Margaret's arms, she felt her heart expand in ways she had not thought possible. "He is perfect," she whispered, touching the baby's tiny fingers, marveling at the miracle of him. Isaac knelt beside the bed, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and son. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for this gift, for this life, for everything." They named him Jacob after Isaac's father, and he became the center of their universe. Margaret had worried that motherhood might overwhelm her, might trigger memories of all she had lost, but instead, it felt like completion. Jacob was not a replacement for anything that had come before, but a new beginning, a testament to the possibility of joy after sorrow. Isaac proved to be as devoted a father as she had known he would be. He would walk the floor with Jacob during fussy nights, sing to him in his deep voice, talk to him about the ranch and the cattle as if the baby could understand every word. Watching them together filled Margaret with a contentment so profound, it sometimes brought her to tears. As Jacob grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. They were able to purchase additional land, expanding their grazing territory. Isaac's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher brought more business their way. Margaret's management of their finances ensured they weathered the economic ups and downs that affected many of their neighbors. When Jacob was 2, Margaret became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In the spring of 1881, they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Emma, and she was as different from her brother as night from day. Where Jacob was boisterous and active, Emma was contemplative and gentle. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's delicate features. With 2 small children, life became even busier. Margaret sometimes felt as if she were constantly in motion, meeting the needs of her growing family while still managing her share of ranch responsibilities. But it was a good kind of busy, the kind that came from a life full of purpose and love. One evening, when Jacob was 4 and Emma was 2, Margaret stood on the porch watching the sunset while the children played nearby. Isaac came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different my life is from what I imagined it would be," Margaret said. "When Thomas died, I thought that was the end of my story. I truly believed I would live out my days alone, just surviving until survival itself seemed pointless. And now," Isaac prompted, "now I know that was not the end at all. It was just a chapter closing so a new one could begin." She turned in his arms to face him. "You showed me that life is not a single story but many stories woven together. That loss does not have to be the final word." Isaac kissed her gently. "You showed me what love could really be," he said. "What partnership and true companionship look like. Every day with you is a gift I never expected to receive." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors, their children's laughter floating on the evening air. In that moment, Margaret felt the full weight of her blessings. Not just the obvious ones like health and prosperity, but the harder-won blessings of healing and hope renewed. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were droughts that threatened the herd and harsh winters that tested their endurance. There were illnesses that frightened them and financial worries that kept them awake at night. But they faced everything together, their partnership strengthened by each obstacle overcome. Jacob grew into a sturdy boy who loved working alongside his father, learning the ins and outs of ranching with eager enthusiasm. Emma developed a talent for gentling horses, able to calm even the most skittish animals with her patient presence. Margaret watched them grow with pride and wonder, seeing the best of both her and Isaac reflected in their children. In the summer of 1885, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again at 31 years old. The news came as a surprise, as they had assumed their family was complete with 2 children. But the surprise quickly gave way to joy as they prepared to welcome another child. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, perhaps because Margaret was older now, perhaps simply because each pregnancy was different. She tired more easily and suffered from persistent nausea. Isaac insisted she reduce her workload, and this time she did not argue, recognizing her body's limitations. Their third child, a son they named Daniel, was born in February of 1886 during a late-season snowstorm. He was smaller than his siblings had been, and for a few frightening days, they worried he might not thrive. But Daniel proved tougher than his size suggested, and soon he was nursing vigorously and gaining weight. Jacob and Emma were enchanted with their baby brother, wanting to help with everything. Margaret watched her 3 children together and felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. This life, this family, this love that surrounded her at every turn was so far beyond anything she had dared imagine in those dark days after Thomas's death. As Daniel grew, the ranch continued to expand. They now employed several ranch hands to help manage the increasing herd. Isaac had become one of the most respected ranchers in the region, known for his integrity and the quality of his cattle. Margaret's role had evolved as well. She not only managed the accounts, but had become involved in local business organizations, one of the few women to do so. Her opinion was sought on matters of community importance. She served on the committee to establish a proper school in Sierra City, ensuring that children in the area would have access to better education than what had previously been available. She also helped organize a lending library, remembering her own love of books and wanting to share that gift with others. Sarah's children were now teenagers and young adults, and the families remained close despite the demands of their separate lives. Sarah often remarked on the transformation she had seen in Margaret over the years. "When Isaac first told me about you, When he said he was going to help the widow Zimmerman, I worried," Sarah confessed one afternoon while they worked together in Margaret's kitchen. "I thought he was setting himself up for heartbreak, that you might never be ready to love again." "I worried about the same thing," Margaret admitted. "I felt so broken, so convinced that my capacity for happiness had died with Thomas." "But look at you now," Sarah said, gesturing around the warm, bustling kitchen where children's drawings hung on the walls and the smell of fresh baked bread filled the air. "You are not just alive, you are truly living." Margaret smiled, thinking about how right Sarah was. She was not the same woman who had stood alone at that graveside in 1878. That woman had been hollowed out by loss, unable to see beyond her grief. The woman she had become understood that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the past did not mean being trapped by it. She thought about Thomas sometimes, especially on quiet mornings when she had a moment to herself. She remembered him with fondness and gratitude for the years they had shared, but she no longer felt guilty about her happiness with Isaac. Thomas had been a good man who had loved her, and she believed he would have wanted her to find love again, to build a full life rather than merely existing. As the children grew older, Margaret and Isaac found more time for each other again. They would take evening rides together after the children were asleep, exploring the land they had worked so hard to build upon. They would sit on the porch after dinner, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Their physical relationship remained passionate and tender, a source of connection and joy that deepened rather than diminished with time. Isaac still looked at her with the same wonder he had shown on their wedding night, and Margaret still felt her breath catch when he smiled at her in that particular way that said she was his whole world. When Jacob turned 16 in 1895, he took on even more responsibility around the ranch, working alongside the hired hands as an equal. He had his father's natural ability with cattle and his mother's head for business. Margaret and Isaac began to discuss the future of the ranch, how they might eventually transition it to their children. Emma, at 14, was developing her own ambitions. She wanted to breed horses, to build a reputation for quality stock that would complement the cattle operation. Isaac encouraged her dreams, setting aside a portion of land for her to use for her horse breeding project. Margaret appreciated that her husband never assumed their daughter's future would be limited by her gender. Daniel, at 9, was still finding his way, curious about everything and passionate about nothing in particular yet. He loved to read, devouring every book he could get his hands on, and Margaret wondered if he might pursue an education beyond what the local school could provide. One evening in the spring of 1896, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Margaret reflected on how far they had come. "You remember the day you showed up at my door?" she asked Isaac. "Every detail," he replied. "You looked so wary, so ready to turn me away." "I was not sure you would accept my help." "I almost did not," Margaret admitted. "I had convinced myself I did not deserve help, that I was meant to struggle alone." "What changed your mind?" Margaret thought about it. "Something in your eyes," she said finally. "A kind of understanding that could not be faked. You had been where I was, and you made it through to the other side. That gave me hope, even when I did not want to feel it." Isaac pulled her closer. "You saved me too, you know." "I was so focused on just surviving, on building the ranch, that I had forgotten what it felt like to truly live. You reminded me that work is important, but love is what makes it all worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of deep knowing. The sounds of the ranch settled around them, cattle lowing in the distance, the wind rustling through the trees, the creak of the house they had built together. "I love you," Margaret said, simple and true. "I love you too," Isaac replied. "More with every passing day." As the years continued to unfold, the ranch grew into one of the most successful operations in the region. Jacob married a local girl named Catherine when he was 22, and they built a house on the edge of the ranch property. Emma's horse breeding program earned a reputation for excellence, her gentle methods producing animals known for their temperament and reliability. Daniel, as Margaret had suspected, pursued higher education, attending college in San Francisco and eventually becoming a teacher. Margaret and Isaac became grandparents when Jacob and Catherine welcomed a daughter in 1902. Holding her first grandchild, a tiny girl named Rose, Margaret marveled at the continuity of life, at how love created ripples that extended far beyond what one could imagine. She was 48 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined with the marks of a life fully lived. Isaac was 50, his own hair more gray than dark, his body bearing the wear of decades of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people who had found each other in the midst of grief and built something beautiful. They made sure to tell their children and grandchildren their story, wanting them to understand that life could surprise you, that endings were often beginnings in disguise, that love could find you even when you were not looking for it. "Your mother thought her life was over when I met her," Isaac would tell them, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "But it was really just beginning." And Margaret would add, "Your father showed me that it is never too late to start again, to open your heart, to believe in possibility." The ranch continued to thrive under their combined leadership, and eventually under Jacob's management, as Isaac and Margaret gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations. They spent more time with their grandchildren, teaching them to ride, telling them stories, passing on the values that had guided their own lives. In 1910, they celebrated 32 years of marriage with a large gathering that brought together family and friends from across the region. Margaret looked around at the crowd, at the 3 children and 7 grandchildren who bore testament to the life she and Isaac had created, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Happy?" Isaac asked, finding her alone for a moment on the porch of the house they had shared for so many years. "Beyond measure," Margaret replied, leaning into his familiar warmth. "I was just thinking about that young widow who thought she had nothing left to live for. She could not have imagined all this," Isaac said, gesturing to the celebration happening around them. "No," Margaret agreed. "But I am so grateful she was brave enough to accept help when it was offered, brave enough to risk loving again." Isaac turned her to face him, his gray eyes still as clear and steady as they had been that first day on her porch. "I am grateful you let me love you, that you trusted me with your broken heart and let me help you heal it." "You did more than help me heal it," Margaret said, touching his face. "You showed me it was never really broken, just waiting for the right person to remind it how to feel again." They kissed, there on the porch surrounded by the sounds of their family celebrating, and Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. All the pain and loss, all the fear and uncertainty, all the small acts of courage that had added up to a life beyond her wildest dreams. As the years advanced and they moved into their 70s, their pace slowed but their love never dimmed. They spent quiet days together, working in the garden, reading on the porch, watching their grandchildren grow into young adults. They celebrated births and mourned deaths, weathered hardships and savored joys, always together, always partners. When Isaac fell ill in the winter of 1920, Margaret nursed him with fierce devotion. She sat by his bedside, holding his hand, reminding him of all they had shared. She was not ready to lose him, not ready to face the world without the man who had shown her how to live again. But Isaac rallied, his strong constitution pulling him through the illness. When he was well enough to sit up, he pulled Margaret into his arms. "I am not ready to leave you yet," he said. "We still have too much living to do." And so they did. They lived to see their great-grandchildren born, to celebrate 60 years of marriage, to watch the ranch they had built together continue to prosper under the stewardship of their descendants. Margaret Northwood died peacefully in her sleep in 1928, at the age of 74, with Isaac holding her hand. She left behind 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. But more than that, she left a legacy of resilience and hope, a testament to the power of second chances. Isaac followed her just 6 months later. Those who knew him said he had simply been ready to be with his beloved wife again. He was laid to rest beside her in the cemetery in Sierra City, their headstones standing together as they had stood in life. On Margaret's headstone, beneath her name and dates, was inscribed a simple phrase that captured the essence of her story. She believed her life was over, but love showed her it was just beginning. And on Isaac's, an equally simple tribute. He saw her sorrow and offered his heart, and together they built a legacy of love. Their story became part of the family lore, passed down through generations. Children and grandchildren would visit the ranch, now expanded far beyond what Margaret and Isaac could have imagined, and hear about the widow who thought she had nothing left, and the cowboy who showed her otherwise. They would learn about the importance of showing up for people in pain, of offering help without expecting anything in return, of being brave enough to love again after loss. They would understand that their family, their legacy, their very existence was rooted in an act of compassion and the courage to accept it. The house where Margaret and Isaac had raised their family still stood, carefully preserved by generations who understood its significance. The porch where they had sat so many evenings still offered the same view of rolling hills and grazing cattle. The bedroom where their children had been born still held the bed they had shared for 6 decades. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was right, those who knew their story swore they could feel their presence, could sense the love that had saturated every board and beam of the place. Not as ghosts or spirits, but as the lingering echo of 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and built something that would outlast their mortal years. Jacob's great-great-grandson, working the ranch more than 100 years after Margaret and Isaac had first joined their lives, would sometimes stand on that porch and think about his ancestors. He would think about the widow who had lost everything, and the cowboy who had given her a reason to hope. He would think about how a single act of kindness, a decision to help someone in need, had rippled forward through time to create the life he now lived. And he would understand in a deep and abiding way that love was not just an emotion but a force of creation, a power that could transform sorrow into joy, endings into beginnings, death into new life. He would understand that the greatest legacy his ancestors had left was not the land or the cattle or the financial success, but the example of how to love fearlessly, how to show up for others, how to believe in possibility even in the darkest moments. Margaret Zimmerman had stood at a graveside in 1878 and believed her life was over. Isaac Northwood had knocked on her door and showed her it was just beginning. Together, they had created a love story that transcended their own lives, a testament to the enduring power of compassion, courage, and the human capacity for renewal. Their story reminded everyone who heard it that it is never too late to start again, never too late to open your heart, never too late to believe that better days might lie ahead. It reminded them that sometimes the end of one chapter is simply making room for the beginning of another, and that the greatest adventures often begin when we are brave enough to accept help, to trust again, to love again. In the end, That was their true legacy, not measured in acres or cattle or even in the number of descendants they left behind, but in the simple, profound truth that love endures, hope persists, and life always offers us another chance if we are willing to take it.